Ohio State fans, hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. If you're confused a little bit where Dave or Dan or Bill or any of the guys are, or why this is airing, if you're watching live in the middle of the afternoon on Thursday, we're trying something new. I wanted to do a little bit of a different podcast. I've been thinking about this for a while, kind of spent the offseason pondering how we wanted to do it, and I wanted to do something a bit more lengthy, where we could chat a little bit more about what happens each week in Buckeye football and probably carry this on if it works well into Buckeye basketball. And I thought that there needed to be something different about it. So we're doing it a little bit different. As you can see here, we're calling it Bucknuts Happy Hour. Normally we'll do this towards the end of the week. We'll try and do it towards the end of the workday. So if people want to kick back and grab a beverage, or when they listen to it towards the end of the week, they can grab a beverage and enjoy it. My thought is, one of my favorite things to do, have a beer with some buddies, talk about sports. Why not do that with you guys? I know everyone loves to talk Buckeyes who tunes into all of our great BM5 shows. So yeah, if you're done with work for the day, it may be a little bit early this week. We've just timed it a little bit differently, but if you can and you want to grab a beverage, feel free. I've got a Bell's Two Hearted here that I will sip on, and our Paramount Plus, which is part of our CBS network of streaming services, which will be a part of the new Big Ten package. So I'm doing a little marketing there, but this is the first episode, and we're going to kind of see how it goes. I have some ideas for how I want to do things for future episodes as we get into the season here. We'll probably try and have some guests on, people who cover the opposing team. I've already got someone lined up, hopefully for Notre Dame next week, and that should be fun. But really what I want this to be is I'll come with some ideas on things I want to talk about, kind of recapping each week, maybe the game before a little bit, dive into next week's opponent. But I want you guys to comment, and you can kind of drive the conversation, just like we're all sitting around at a happy hour talking about the Buckeyes. So this podcast is going to be a little bit different. If you're tuning in live, I'd love you to be a part of it and kind of drive the conversation. But today, like I said, we're going to start with kind of recapping what's happened this offseason. I know a lot of people have paid a lot of attention. Ohio State fans, the Bucknuts community is great at keeping up with what's going on. So some of it may be stuff you already know. I'm going to give kind of my thoughts on the offense and players that I think maybe we haven't talked about quite enough. We'll move to the defense and what I'm surprised about what we've heard about the defense. And we'll look ahead to this upcoming season. Dave Biddle did a piece that's on our site this week that ranked Ohio State's 2022 opponents. We'll kind of go through that. I'll give some of my thoughts. You guys can give your thoughts as well. And just kind of go from there. This one may be a little bit shorter just because we don't have a guest. There were a couple people I reached out to that were just unable to do it this week. Some guys who know a thing or two about what's going on over at the Woody. But we'll get guys on. I don't want to spoil that because we'll try and have people on throughout the year. So that's kind of my idea. I posted on the front row on Bucknuts today. If you have ideas for this show, feel free to post them on there. Like I said, I want this to be not just about me, not just about Bucknuts, and we may have Steve or Dave host it at times, but I want you guys to kind of help drive this, and let's make it fun. Let's make this a little bit different, and let's kind of enjoy it as we go through the season and see where it goes. And it may change, things may change, but we're going to enjoy it. So cheers, and let's get it going. So as I said, it's been a crazy offseason for the Buckeyes. Obviously, everyone knows where Ohio State ended last year. If you've paid attention to the team, obviously there's been a lot of changes. If you've paid attention to this Ohio State beat, there's been a lot of changes. People moving sites, new sites popping up. There's been some drama, as those that have paid attention know. I would like to point out that Bucknuts continues to be consistent. I was the last new hire at Bucknuts, the last full-time hire at least. Mark Porter's done a great job contributing with us, and there have been some other part-time people that have helped out from time to time, but we've been super consistent. We're really proud of what we do. We hope you guys are too. And that's nothing against the new sites and the sites that have changed. Things happen, and we understand that. But yeah, like I said, a busy off season for everyone involved. On the Ohio State front, you've obviously are aware of what happened with the coaching staff. Only Larry Johnson back on the defensive side. I think everyone agrees that was for the best. no doubt about it. And as we've gotten to know and talk to Jim Knowles, who's new defensive coordinator, Tim Walton, Perry Eliano, I think Ryan Day's made some home run hires. I really do. I really like what Jim Knowles has brought. He's just so different than really any other football coach. And I've talked to a lot of them at different levels. He's just different. He's an Ivy League grad. He was a guy who was working on Wall Street. If you've read his stories, and decided, he missed football and wanted to get back into it when he was young, and, cut his pay significantly to get into coaching, and has worked his way to the top of the defensive coaching. It was even a head coach for a little bit. So Ryan Day found his head coach of the defense. Tim Walton, former Buckeye cornerback, played at Ohio State in the early 90s, had some success as an NFL coach. I know everyone knows the quote from Jalen Ramsey, who obviously just won the Super Bowl with my LA Rams, and about how that's the best coach he's been around. I think that's a pretty ringing endorsement for a guy coming in to Ohio State to kind of help rebuild this secondary that hasn't been great the last few years. And then you add in Perry Eliano, who worked magic at Cincinnati, working alongside Luke Fickell last year. That defense had 2 All-Americans in the secondary. They got to the college football playoff, the first group of 5 team to do so. So Ryan Day's so far on paper hit it out of the park. And we'll get to more on the defense, but I don't think we've talked enough about Justin Fry. And I'm going to start there when we're talking offense. And the thing that I think he will add the most, aside from kind of taking some new ideas from Greg Studrawa, is that he wasn't just a offensive line coach working under Chip Kelly. He was an offensive coordinator. He was a run game coordinator at Ohio State. So he's going to add more than just your typical offensive line coach. And you're going to see, I think, just some more creative things for the way Ohio State does things in the run game. I think that this is really going to help the Buckeyes. You look last year, we all know it, those short yardage situations where the running backs, Travion Henderson, really the offensive line didn't get pushed, but the running backs really struggled to kind of get things going in those short yardage situations. You saw big plays from time to time, but I think, having another year of experience, having a different looking offensive line, and we'll talk about one offensive lineman who I think is going to be really important to that in a minute, but I really like the hire of Justin Fry, and I don't think he's gotten enough talk this offseason, and include me in that. I write about the Buckeyes, and I've only written about him once or twice. So I think that that's going to be something that by the end of the season, people are like, maybe that hire was just as important as the hire on the defensive side of the ball, the 3 coaches that came in. We'll see. That's just my opinion. I like talking to Justin Fry. I think he's a really smart guy as well, but I think he adds a lot to kind of the creativity that they may have in the run game, in addition to just the offensive line and kind of how they're going to block and just the fundamentals of offensive line football. Now, we know this offense is great, right? We saw it last year. We expect them to pick up right where they left off. I think that there's no reason to think that CJ Stroud and the rest of this group is going to regress, right? They did lose Chris Olave. They did lose Garrett Wilson. They did lose Jeremy Ruckert. But they are loaded at wide receiver. They have a tight end room with 4 guys who I think are very talented. And Cade Stover is a guy that I'm going to touch on in a minute. I think the one thing that you have to see is you have to see growth from this group. CJ Stroud can't be stagnant and just be the same player he was last year. Defenses know about him. They've got film. They're going to be ready for him. Week 1, Notre Dame, for instance. Jackson Smith and Jigba, same thing. He doesn't have 2 guys outside of him that are going to demand the attention that Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave did last year. So it's on them it was on them, I should say, to raise the level of their game. Same with Travion Henderson, really same with everybody, but those guys in particular. And that's where the offense will rise, take its next step. And I've been really pleased with what we've seen. When we were out at the recruiting camps throughout the summer, there would be times when a number of the receivers would be out there with some of the quarterbacks, and it was kind of a mixed match group. They'd be on one end of the indoor field that wasn't being used, working on running routes, working on timing, things like that. And that's just the few hours out of the whole summer that we were there this summer for those recruiting camps. Those guys have put in the work, and I think that's really good to see. I'd let you know if I thought that CJ Stroud was relaxing this summer or Jackson was relaxing. That hasn't happened. These guys are driven. And I think, honestly, as good as they were last year, they know it wasn't good enough. The Buckeyes didn't win the Big Ten. The Buckeyes didn't win the national championship. They didn't make the college football play. They didn't make the Big Ten championship game. As good as that offense was, and I've argued with that, it wasn't the offense's fault that they lost either of those games to Oregon or Michigan. They put up big numbers, but you did see a drop-off from their points per game in both of those games. I think they scored 28 and 27, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, in Oregon, against Oregon and against Michigan. Obviously, the defense is what let the team down ultimately in those games. But for the number one offense in the country, you want consistency. And I think they realize that if they're even better, then that takes some pressure off of the defense having to be that much better. And, that offense can push this team to success. And again, we'll get to the defense in a few minutes, but I think that you'll see another level from CJ Stroud, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. TreVeyon Henderson, I expect to jump from his freshman year to his sophomore year. You see that with a lot of guys. That's a guy who didn't play as a senior in high school because of COVID stuff. He is a guy I'm really excited about, and as I mentioned with Justin Fry, I think he can take a leap with this running game. So those are kind of the known commodities, right? The guys that have to take that next step. Yeah, and DG day drinking. Cheers to that. Have another sip of our drink here as we go through this Bucknuts Happy Hour. What I want to talk about is the guys that have maybe not stepped up yet that we think can. And if you guys have people that you are excited about on the offensive side of the ball that maybe haven't had a chance to make their impact, let us know. Put it in the comment section here. I'm curious for your guys' thoughts as well. But I have a couple in mind. And they're not sexy names necessarily. You know Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka, those guys. You expect them to jump out there and be big-time players for the Buckeyes. But one that is big for me, Cade Stover. I'm really excited about Cade Stover. He's not going to catch 30 passes and have a career year in terms of what Ohio State tight ends have done lately, just because Buckeyes have too many weapons. But I think he's really become that all-around tight end that the Buckeyes need. And you've seen it when this offense can put out that one tight end that can do a little bit of everything. I think that they're just better. I mean, the stats prove that. And Ryan Day loves to run out that tight end, whether he catches the ball or not. And we've seen Jeremy Ruckert. We saw Luke Farrell make big catches, but their blocking, their ability to pull defenders away when they're running routes, I think that's huge. Obviously, Cade Stover has been in the program now. This is his fourth year. So he's adjusted to tight end. Did have that brief cameo back on defense last year. I think it's frankly awesome that he's willing to, on a moment's notice, basically jump over and play linebacker again for this team. Just shows how much he loves this team and is willing to do whatever to win. And he's worked hard. I talked to him a couple times over the summer, and he said that this was not only his best summer at Ohio State, but the best summer he's had as a team, he's seen as a team at Ohio State. So he's a guy that I'm excited about that could take a leap. And, I think they're going to do a lot of different things with the tight ends. I think you'll see the group behind him, Joe Royer, Mitch Rossi, G. Scott Jr., all get in games, all have roles. But I think Cade Stover's he's a captain. He's a leader of this group. He's a leader of the team. I think he's a guy who we could talk about for a while without even mentioning what he's going to do statistically. DG with another one, Mayan Williams. That's a guy who I was going to discuss as well. I think if you're going to have TreVeyon Henderson out there, and maybe he doesn't get banged up as much as we saw last year. There were a number of games where he didn't play in the second half. Now the Buckeyes were up comfortably. But I think Mayan Williams is going to have an interesting role. And unfortunately, Evan Pryor, the redshirt freshman running back, in knee injury is going to miss the season, which I think means there's going to be even a little bit more on Mayan Williams. And obviously those are two very different players. TreVeyon Henderson and Mayan Williams are different players. But looking across the years with Ohio State, having a good running back as your number two has been important for this team. I mean, even J.K. Dobbins' year where he rushed for 2,000 yards, you still needed Master Teague at times. I mean, look at that Clemson game. Obviously, the Buckeyes unfortunately lost that one, and I know that's still a controversy for some people. But you look at what Master Teague had to do stepping in at times for J.K. Dobbins. You just never know. And like I said, TreVeyon Henderson missed a few games or a few halves last year or quarters, if you will, with some not severe injuries, but he kind of slipped up, had interviews this spring and mentioned, playing with a concussion and things like that. If you have a Mayan Williams that you trust, that's huge. And I also think, going back to what I said with Justin Fry, the short yardage stuff, Mayan Williams is your guy. I wrote about it, I think, last week. He is more than willing to be that short yardage, third down back, and just pick up those dirty yards. And I think you're going to see him in other roles than that. But I think he is a guy who could really make a difference in those situations. He's reshaped his body this offseason. He looks different. I think maybe you won't notice it when he's in pads and everything, but when we've talked to him a couple times this offseason, even from spring to when we talked to him 2 weeks ago or whatever it was, he's been great. He looks physically different, and I think that's going to make a difference. I think the weight is where you want it to be now after a couple of years within the program. Going beyond that, another guy on the offensive line, and I see a few people here have mentioned the offensive lineman. The big one for me is Matthew Jones. And I know Donovan Jackson stepping in at guard is going to be interesting, but Matthew Jones has waited his time. He's been in the program for a long time now. He has been kind of a utility man on this offensive line, right? And if you watched him last year, it almost worked better when he came in as a guard as opposed to having all those tackles across the offensive line. Now, they wanted to keep guys happy. They said they wanted to have the best five on the field. I would argue that the best five isn't always the most talented five, but I wasn't going to argue with Greg Studrawa and Ryan Day about that. But I think this line makes a lot more sense, and I think Matthew Jones is a big reason why. Veteran guy, he's played a good amount of football for a guy who's starting for the first time, and I think he's motivated. He's not a guy who talks a lot, but I just get the sense when we did talk to him that he realizes this is his time, and he's got 1 year. He's got 1 year to prove that he's not only a very good offensive lineman for Ohio State, but I assume he has dreams of the NFL like all of these guys do. You go out there and you put together all Big Ten, maybe a push for an All-American spot. How huge would that be for the Buckeyes to have that in a first-year starting guard? And obviously, like I said, you've got Donovan Jackson, a young guy on the other side, great role model to look up to in Matthew Jones. I think that could be a difference maker in this offensive line. We saw at times in practice where they're pulling guards and doing plays to the outside. So, if Matthew Jones is able to do some of that stuff that maybe the tackles weren't as good at doing last year, the tackles that were playing guards, and Thayer Munford and Paris Johnson, I think that's going to be huge for the Buckeyes. So those are my three that have stood out to me in terms of guys that just haven't gotten the talk. Like I said, Marvin Harrison Jr., we talked to him on Wednesday. Guy's a freak. Emeka Egbuka, a freak. I'm writing a story right now. I know someone mentioned it in the comments right now or earlier that him on kick returns. I'm writing a story just about that. It'll probably be out this evening. But yeah, here it is from DG again. Man, you've been a prime commenter. Emeka Egbuka, he's definitely doing kickoffs. I don't know if we'll see him on punt returns just because of kind of how they set that all up. But kick returns, he kind of owned that position when we talked to him on Wednesday. He said that he can learn things about being a receiver from being a kick return guy. And, I think he's going to have a big role in the offense too. I just think I know because Brian Hartline said it. They have 6 guys that they trust to play. That's Jackson Smith-Njigba, Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka, Julian Fleming, Jaden Ballard, and Xavier Johnson. And Xavier Johnson revealed to us on Wednesday that he was actually put on scholarship, former walk-on, put on scholarship last year before the Oregon game, but didn't want to make a big deal about it. Ohio State never announced it. Ryan Day was actually asked, I think Dave Biddle asked him earlier this week about the scholarship numbers, and it was clear that he didn't want to talk about it. So we learned from Xavier Johnson. Congrats to him. But those are 6 guys. When you have 6 guys, you're typically going to line up 3 wide receivers at a time. There may be times when guys are the odd man out. If Emeka Egbuka can make the special teams game part of his book of his young story here at Ohio State, I think that's something that could be huge for the Buckeyes. And, you don't need him always to be an elite wide receiver at this point, though I think he will be. I think he's going to be a big part of the offense as well. But I do think special teams, at least kick return, we'll see about punt return. They've had a number of guys kind of working at that position when we've been out at practice. DG, sorry to hear that. He says he's stuck at home with COVID. So hopefully you're feeling all right. Hopefully you get healthy soon. The offense, as I said, I think is going to be on a different level this year. And we saw it last year. We saw it when, the Buckeyes were at their best. But the big question, and I think everyone's kind of curious about this, is what the defense is going to look like. And I've been asked when I've done some radio shows, things like that, about the defensive side of the ball and just kind of my expectations. I don't know. Until they get out there and play, I'm kind of the wait and see type of guy. I have to see it on the field. What we've seen from when we've been out at practice has looked really good. And I'm really encouraged by what we've seen, what we've heard from the guys. Jim Knowles talking about how he's got 75% of the defense put in, I thought was really interesting. They're ahead of schedule there. They're ahead of schedule with what he got. Not surprisingly, but when he was at Oklahoma State, a different level of athlete, a different level of player. So it's not surprising that he's gotten more put in his first year. But I think you're seeing that guys have taken what Jim Knowles is teaching them and kind of just embraced it. And they want to be better. They absolutely want to be better. And the proof will be in the pudding there. Nice comment here. Patrick, please tell us you want to abandon college football in November, instead travel to Qatar for the World Cup. I will not be going to Qatar. I will be watching a lot of the World Cup, but nothing will change in terms of my coverage of the Buckeyes. We'll be keeping it up. It's Michigan week, the first week of the World Cup. I'm going to be as busy as I am all season. So no, I will not do that. No, we'll be good. Don't worry about that. Yeah, we're asked here. DG says 2 linebacker look, safety heavy. Correct. That's exactly what it's going to be. And I was just going to touch on that because it's going to be different. It's not a completely revolutionary style of defense that Jim Knowles wants to run, but it is different than what we've seen from the Buckeyes in the past. And here's what we know. You've got your 4 offensive linemen. There'll be 1 defensive end that's that hybrid Jack Leo position. We expect that to be Jack Sawyer, but some other guys are in the mix. At linebacker, the true linebackers, when they go with their base defense, are assuming health, Steel Chambers, Tommy Eichenberg. And those names, I've talked to buddies of mine, other people that have said to me, well, those guys didn't look great last year. I agree. I think that Steel Chambers came on as he kind of learned the position. And, remember, he was a running back at the beginning of last offseason. So he was relearning the position and kind of figuring out how to go about it. I think that he's now got a year under his belt. He understands it. He's working directly with Jim Knowles, which is also the case with Tommy Eichenberg. And Tommy Eichenberg, I feel like, has gotten a bad rep. He's kind of been labeled that slow white linebacker. And, I don't want to talk race here, but we've seen a few of those at Ohio State that just haven't been able to keep up when they're on the elite level. I think of, Tough Borland, who was unfairly matched up and with receivers in that Alabama national championship game. I saw that going around the other day for some reason. But I think Tommy Eichenberg is a guy who he's a football guy, and he doesn't want to, he hates doing the media stuff. He hates talking to us. He wants to do football. And I think that a guy like that looks at his tape, figures out what he did wrong in his first year as a starter, and takes the next step. Now, again, all of this is with the caveat that we've got to see it in just over a week against Notre Dame. But I like the fact that Jim Knowles is coaching these linebackers. And there's depth. Diamante Chip Trainum coming over. CJ Hicks, I know someone asked about him. Guy looks like a freak out there. I think he's a guy who can be a part of this defense. Maybe not right away, because there is quite a bit of depth, but he's certainly going to factor in somewhere. Maybe special teams initially, but that's a star of the future. There's a lot of guys in this linebacker room. So, if it's not working, if they have to rotate guys, Taraja Mitchell, another guy who can certainly play. We saw him some last year. He's a 5th-year senior, I believe. So plenty of guys there. We move on to the secondary. It's going to be interesting with cornerback. Beyond the starters in Denzel Burke and Cam Brown, if he's healthy, what they do depth-wise. We heard it already this fall camp with some guys getting banged up. I think, based on what Ryan Day said and the guys that we've seen. Now, we haven't actually watched any of practice for a little over a week now. They kind of shut it down. But we have been there after practice for interviews. We see them walking off the field. Jordan Hancock, who may still be a bit questionable headed into Notre Dame, looked good to me. I said to another reporter yesterday as we were walking off, or they were walking off the field, I thought that Jordan Hancock kind of looked like, he was bouncing a little bit as he walked, a little bit of a jump, a little bump in his step, so to speak. That's good news to me. I think that looks like a guy who's getting healthy. Dave Biddle, actually, and if you watch the BM5 or listen to the BM5, he mentioned this, I believe, on there, that he walked in one day as we went to watch practice with Jordan Hancock, and Jordan Hancock said, "I'll be fine." And so, not that he's going to tell Dave if he's hurt, but, just the way he said it, Dave thought it was pretty confident. And, so you've got those guys at corner. J.K. Johnson, another guy, Jair Brown, a freshman who lost his black stripe. So you've got some depth there, not as much as you'd like. Cameron Martinez has taken some reps at corner as well. He's a versatile guy who was at safety. I think will still prominently be at safety, but could play corner if they need him to. He's done some coverage stuff in the past, and he's just an athletic freak, let's be honest. And then the safeties, safety-driven defense. That's what Jim Knowles has said. And you've got what we believe are going to be the starters. Ronnie Hickman at the adjuster. That's your free safety. That's the back end of your defense. They call it the adjuster because he's the guy who's adjusting the defense after they get on the field. The bandit is kind of your strong safety. That's going to be, we believe, Josh Proctor, though Court Williams is certainly making a lot of noise for a guy who may not start right away. I really like Court Williams, but I really like Josh Proctor. I think that both of those guys, if you need different situations, you can see him in there. And then you've got the nickel where Tanner McAllister, who transferred over from Oklahoma State and has kind of been a coach on the field for these guys, knows Jim Knowles in and out. And you can tell why those two get along. If you've watched Tanner McAllister, we had a video with him earlier, I think last week. You can tell that why those guys get along, just smart guys who like football. And so those will be your starters. Lathan Ransom, I wrote about him coming back from the broken leg, has really impressed in fall camp. He'll be a guy in the mix at that nickel spot. Cameron Martinez as well. So, that's kind of the defense as we see it now. Now, things are going to change some. When Ohio State plays some of those, power eye traditional sets this year, and you're going to see it. You got Wisconsin, you got Iowa on the schedule. Those are going to be times when you can't just line up with three safeties out there necessarily, three traditional kind of safeties, a nickel, and, hope for the best. You're certainly going to have to, have some guys can make tackles. And that's where Court Williams could come into play. They could play with a third linebacker. Jim Knowles has talked about what Court Williams can do in terms of being that versatile guy. I think Lathan Ransom is another guy who can be there. It's going to be interesting when they get into games like that and kind of how Jim Knowles adjusts. Because the Big 12, if you've watched Big 12 football, it's a lot of spread offenses, and that's what this defense is ready to defend. So they're going to have to adjust. And Jim Knowles has talked about it. And, he said he wants to keep things, he even said he wants to keep things in the back of his mind that maybe even the rest of his coaches don't know, that he can bring out when they need it against certain teams. You don't necessarily want to be installing things week of game, but he's got some tweaks to that defense that I think will be interesting to watch throughout the season. DG again, will Sonny Styles see the field? I don't know, to be honest. I think that he is a kid with a lot of talent. He's super athletic. When we got to watch all of practice the day that Big Ten Network was out there, excuse me, I was almost forgetting it was happy hour. When we got to watch that practice, Sonny Styles worked with the third team defense. He was playing that adjuster safety. There's been a lot of talk about could he end up playing linebacker for the Buckeyes. When I watched him play in high school, he was just so much more athletic than everybody else out there that it was hard to really get a read on where he's best fit. And I only saw him a couple times, to be completely honest, but I mean, he certainly fits in on this defense. He's going to be something on this defense. So where and when, I think, are the big questions. Just as I mentioned, they've got quite a bit of depth at the safeties position and quite a bit of depth at the linebacker position right now. But I think that he is a guy who they're going to work hard to develop and find a spot for him. And I know it's a weird comparison, but the guy that I've used is Sam Hubbard. Remember, Sam Hubbard came in as a safety, sort of a linebacker. He was a lacrosse player who the story, I'm sure Urban Meyer saw him playing dodgeball and just loved the athleticism. Sonny Styles is different. Sonny Styles is a football player, no doubt about it, did play basketball. I think won a state championship last year. but he's just a guy that athletically, I think you could probably put anywhere on the field. If you get him the right weight and let him learn a little bit, and he could be, he could do well there. And I think the same was true with a guy like Sam Hubbard back in the day. Obviously, he's gone on to do some pretty good things in the NFL. Shout out to the Bengals there. So we'll see on Sam, or we'll see on Sonny Styles. But I think right now, they've got a lot of veterans back, and that's another thing I wanted to touch on with this defense. Last year, if you think about the Minnesota game last year and how many guys they played that were first-time starters, guys, some playing their first time on D. I mean, Denzel Burke, as good as he ended up being, the fact that he started that game as a true freshman as the number one corner. I remember sitting there in the press box at Minnesota Stadium and being like, well, this could be interesting. Well, you've got a true freshman now out there at corner. He turned out to be good, but a lot of those guys, some of those mistakes were guys just not having done it before. And now Ryan Day has said it quite a bit that they are an experienced defense. Guys have made these mistakes, and they understand how to play big time college football defense. And I know maybe that doesn't sound as good to some people, but I think it's a really, really important thing. I think you look at what the top defenses in the country do, the Georgias, the Alabamas, those type of things. Those guys are almost always an experienced defense. And just with the way things went for Ohio State last year was not an experienced group. And so because of that, guys like Sonny Styles, guys like CJ Hicks may not get on the field right away just because they have so much talent coming back. But that talent's going to leave. A lot of these guys can leave after this year, or will have to leave after this year. And so, if they can get snaps and get to understanding this defense, I think it'll be a good building block for some of these young guys, even if they're not immediate stars on this defense. And then the last thing I want to touch on the defense, and I think this could be the most important thing for this defense this year, is the defensive line. When Jim Knowles talked to us for the first time this spring, the thing he brought up was how impressed he was with what the defensive line was doing. And obviously Larry Johnson has done great work with the defensive line at Ohio State, Penn State in the past. And I think that this group is coming together really nicely. If you're Jim Knowles and you're coming out and the first thing you address is not your position group or not even the new coaches' position groups, I think that speaks volumes. I think there's depth at all of the positions across the defensive line. I think that there's talent for sure. I mean, you look at a guy like Zach Harrison, who was a 5-star kid and maybe hasn't lived up to the billing. I wrote about this the other day. Hasn't lived up to the billing entirely as that, elite defensive end. And the numbers maybe aren't where you want him to be, but guy still gets pressures. The guy does a lot of good things. And that's a guy who people aren't even talking about. I mean, he's being overshadowed by JT Tuimalau, Jack Sawyer, the two sophomores who I think are going to have great seasons. And then you've got Javonte Jean-Baptiste and Tyler Friday coming back from an injury. He was voted captain. In the middle, Teron Vincent, Jerron Cage. There's a number of guys in there. Tyleek Williams that had a good freshman year. There's just a number of guys. I'd have to look at the list here. I think that defensive line, if you could get pressure at a better rate than you did a year ago, and if you could get to the quarterback, the stopping the run has to be better. That takes a lot of pressure off of that back seven and makes their job a lot easier. And I think it's a positive sign that Jim Knowles quickly pointed to that group as being, an elite group so far in practice. Again, it'll need to be shown week 1 against Notre Dame and throughout the course of the season, but I like that a lot. And the last thing I want to touch on before we get into kind of the schedule and what Dave kind of projected as the toughest opponents for the Buckeyes, or ranked the toughest opponents for the Buckeyes, is just where this defense needs to be. And I know Dave's talked about it. I've been on the BM5 before talking about it a little bit, but I wrote a story over the summer that this defense, it would be great. And you guys tell me what you think about where this defense will be this year in terms of ranks and things like that. But if this defense is top 30, last year they barely made it inside the top 60 in terms of total defense yardage wise. If this defense Cheers, Sarge. If this defense can be top 30, I think that with what the offense is expected to do, I think you're in a good spot. I think you can be the Big Ten champion pretty easily, frankly. I think you can get to the college football playoff. And I think, if this defense ranks top 30 at the end of the year, that means that they could have been struggling a little bit early on, figuring it out as the season goes. It doesn't have to be top 30 week 1 against Notre Dame. Maybe it will be. That would be great. I think everyone would be excited to see this defense go out and really make a statement against Notre Dame. But, this defense is going to get better throughout the course of the season. And I think if you rank roughly around the top 30 and you get into the college football playoff and you have this offense, we'll see what other teams do. We'll see what Georgia looks like. We'll see what Alabama looks like. We'll see what all these teams look like. But my money's on the Buckeyes if this defense is top 30. Now, if you can take it another step further, if you can go top 20, top 15, if Jim Knowles can really work some magic and these guys are so bought in and the talent really comes out and everything clicks, you're talking about a team that has the elite level offense that LSU had a few years ago with Joe Burrow and those guys. And now you're talking about defense. And they were about a top 30 defense. And now you're talking about a defense that is top 15. Woo! I think the Buckeyes are, I don't know what you do, because if you can't slow them down, and even the teams that beat the Buckeyes struggle to do that at times, and then the Buckeyes are getting stops on a regular basis and not just enough stops, then, this team certainly is a national championship level team in my mind. And I think they are anyway. I certainly think they are. DG, you asked what beer I'm drinking. This is Bell's Two Hearted. It was what was in the fridge today. I'm a big Bell's fan, so shout out to them. Maybe if this show goes well enough, people will, we'll get some sponsorships for some of these beers that we drink. And if you're having a beer, I know it's a little early, like I said, to start, but let us know. We'll usually do this a little later in the day, so it won't always be 3:30 Eastern time when we record. So we touched on defense, hit on a couple questions here that people have asked. Time for the Wisconsin game. I'm going to guess that could be a big noon game, I guess. I would guess that's certainly an afternoon game. I don't think they're going to have 3 out of their first 4 games as primetime night games. Also, Wisconsin will be, Wisconsin at that point will probably still be a top 25 team, but I don't see it being like the marquee game of the week. If Ohio State and Wisconsin played early or later in the year, certainly could be. I think that there are probably 5 off the top of my head: Notre Dame, Wisconsin, Michigan State, Iowa, Penn State, Michigan 6. So you could have half your schedule potentially be against ranked teams. I know Penn State's not ranked right now. I don't think Iowa is, but I think you could potentially, by the time you play those teams, play those. So I think there'll be a number of times. Obviously, the big noon kickoff changes things in terms of when the games are and stuff like that. But I would guess Wisconsin is either noon or 3:30. Just a hunch on my part. I don't know anything for sure. JK in the box or on the field? Which JK? Who are we talking about there? You talk about Jim Knowles. Jim Knowles, I believe, is a field coach. From what he said in the past, if I remember that correctly. So I think he'll be down on the field. I think he likes the feel of that. I could be wrong. I think that's what he told us earlier this offseason. It was a press conference or it was an interview session where I was with someone else. So that was told to me secondhand. I want to dive into one of Dave's stories that he posted this week on Ohio State's 2022 opponents. If you haven't looked at this, I'll break it down real quick. So Dave went from the easiest to the toughest. He had Arkansas State, Toledo, Rutgers, at Northwestern, Indiana, at Maryland, Iowa, at Michigan State, Wisconsin, at Penn State, home game against Notre Dame, home game against Michigan as his order. Feel free to jump on and kind of look at that as we talk here. But we were discussing this as Dave was working on it. I think it's going to be interesting at the bottom end, kind of the easier end of the schedule, so to speak. These 2 non-conference games that aren't the Notre Dame game are going to be interesting. Now, the Buckeyes should win. Let's not make any mistake about it. But Toledo's one of the teams that's favored in the MAC. this isn't just a team that's going to come into the shoe and roll over. I don't think they've got some talent on that team. I think Steve said to Dave when we were discussing it, he may put Toledo ahead of Rutgers or Northwestern. I don't know about Northwestern. I think Northwestern could be interesting this year, but Toledo's a team that, it could be a game where you just feel a little uncomfortable in the first half and they're doing some things. Arkansas State, I'm going to be honest, I haven't looked a ton into what Arkansas State has. What I do know they have, interestingly enough, is Brian Snead, the running back that went to Ohio State, had some issues off the field, and ended up transferring. I think he was up at a community college in Iowa, and now is at Arkansas State. That's a guy who, A, very talented. He was a guy that the Buckeyes liked a lot in terms of what he could do on the field. And B, I imagine, given that he is no longer on this roster and could have been a factor, I think that that's a game where he's going to be pretty motivated. I would imagine so. Now, obviously he doesn't have the offensive line around him or anything like that he would have at Ohio State, but he was a highly recruited kid. It'll just be interesting to see how the Buckeyes control that game and that type of player coming back to the horseshoe. But I think Dave's more or less got it right. Generally, these non-conference, non-Power 5 teams usually are the easier games of the year. Rutgers, some years you might as well label them as one of those. I do like what Greg Schiano's done at Rutgers, second time there. I was always a big Greg Schiano fan. I liked what he did at Ohio State. I think he's a really bright football coach. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where they fit at Northwestern. Look, every couple of years, almost exactly, Northwestern has a season where whether it's they're better than expected or other teams in the Big Ten West just don't live up to their expectations, Northwestern's in the Big Ten championship game. It just seems to happen every couple of years. And as you probably know, Northwestern did not make the Big Ten championship game last year. Did 2 years ago. So, just based on that alone, that's not even any real analysis here. That's just looking at history. And obviously that has nothing to do with what's going to happen this year. But it wouldn't surprise me if Northwestern is a decent team. That's a game at Northwestern. You always talk about the grass there and the length. Curious to see what time of day that is. It would not surprise me if that's a game that is a primetime game there. Obviously, for Northwestern, they can sell that one out with the Buckeyes coming to town. You expect the Buckeyes to be, top 2 in the country still at that point, assuming they get over the hump of Notre Dame early in the year. Dave had Indiana at number 8. Indiana at home. Tom Allen, I thought, had something cooking a couple of years ago, 2020, when he came in to the horseshoe and almost beat Ohio State, and they just haven't been able to sustain it. And that's kind of the problem with some of the Big Ten teams outside of the big boys, is you can have that 1 or 2 years, but getting the recruiting really going and staying with the top guys, I think is always tough. So I like Tom Allen as a coach. I know that they've lost some people from the Hoosier roster, so it'll be interesting there. That game's at home. Dave put at Maryland at number 7. Obviously, they've got some talent offensively, and Mike Locksley is a coach who worked under Nick Saban. It hasn't gone as quickly as I think a lot of people in Maryland thought it might, but there's definitely talent there. And, we've seen it not that long ago. Dwayne Haskins had to lead that ridiculous game in overtime where, they went back and forth, it seemed, the whole game to get a win there. So I don't buy that Maryland's going to be that good. I may have even put Indiana above Maryland just because I think it's a slightly more talented team, but I think those two are close. Iowa was Dave's number 6 team. As we go through this list, look, this is going to be an interesting one for me. I think that the conversation will be that week about Ohio State losing at Iowa. What was it, 2017? Now, these guys weren't a part of that. Most of the coaching staff is gone. But there are a few guys from Iowa that were on the team. I think there are still a couple guys at Ohio State that were on that team. But that's the last time these two teams played. I don't think that that's really a great narrative, but I've already seen it come up. I did a podcast earlier this offseason with a guy who covers Iowa, and he asked me a lot about that game. And so I think that will be a narrative when it comes there. I don't think it's a factor for that game at all, but I do think that, Iowa is a team. I talked about it earlier in terms of Jim Knowles' defense. They're going to line up in the power I formations a lot. They're going to try and grind out games. It's certainly going to be a test for the Buckeyes. Now, fortunately, they'll face Wisconsin already, so they'll have some of that to kind of look back on. But, those are not the spread offenses that you're going to see most of the season. And so it is a little different. It's not quite as drastic as going against a Navy or somebody like that, but it is a little different, especially in this Jim Knowles defense. Moving through Dave's list here, Michigan State at number 5. Yeah, probably. You're going to Michigan State, but as Dave pointed out to me, and I think he mentioned it in here, Ohio State hasn't lost at Michigan State since 1999 when Nick Saban was their head coach. So the Buckeyes have done well, obviously, up in East Lansing. Mel Tucker has built back a team that was pretty good last year. Still probably not what Mark D'Antonio had at his highest peak. But, certainly a solid opponent. And the top 4, I think Dave's got it spot on here. He's got Wisconsin, at Penn State, Notre Dame, and Michigan. Look, you can debate those 4, but Wisconsin's a top 25 team. You have to go at Penn State, and then obviously Notre Dame and Michigan. We'll see what Michigan ends up looking like. It's going to be a pretty soft schedule for the Wolverines, so we may not even know how good that team is actually until they get to the horseshoe at the end of the season. But, the Buckeyes are going to be fired up for that one. I think we know how motivated this team is to get back one on Michigan after last year. You're going into Ohio Stadium. It could be 2 undefeated teams, honestly. I mean, there's the potential, obviously, of any time for someone to slip up. But with Michigan's schedule, it would not surprise me. And honestly, I'm picking Ohio State to go undefeated this year. That Notre Dame game, Dave has at number 2. Certainly an interesting one to open the season. I think anytime you open a season with a marquee opponent, you haven't had that week or 2 to kind of test yourself other than practice. Certainly makes things interesting. I think I was asked about this recently. Obviously, Ohio State's fired up for this, but Notre Dame's, I think it's a 15.5-point underdog. If you're a top 5 team, and these early season rankings don't mean a ton, but I'm sure that Marcus Freeman is using that as bulletin board material. I'm sure that he's going to have the guys buying into the worthy underdogs and things like that. I still think that Ohio State is too talented for Notre Dame, and the atmosphere at the shoe will be overwhelming and whatnot. But, I do think it'll be interesting to see kind of how Marcus Freeman, obviously they've got James Laurinaitis on that staff too. I think that those guys are going to want to make a statement and come into Ohio Stadium and at least hang with the Buckeyes, right? I mean, that's going to be big for Notre Dame. From the Ohio State perspective, you've got to start this season on the right foot. And obviously, 2014, Ohio State lost week 2 to Virginia Tech and still won the national championship. But this team is too good to start this season 0-1. They just are. If the defense is any better, like I talked about earlier, it's got to be week 1. You got to go out and do it. You're a primetime game. Everyone's going to be watching that game. It's 2 ridiculously big brands in Ohio State and Notre Dame. Go out and make your mark. And we're not going to talk about recruiting a ton on this show because it's not a ton of what I do, though Bill Kurlick would like me to do more of it. But this is going to be a huge game for recruiting. You've seen, if you pay attention to the recruiting rankings, where Notre Dame is. They've had a really good offseason for this 2023 class. Ohio State's lost a couple guys, whether from flipping or guys that went elsewhere. There's going to be a lot of guys on campus for that game, a lot of guys in that stadium. You want to put on a show, and especially defensively. And I talked about it earlier. I think this defense is going to get better and better each week. And, the recruits out there are going to see what this defense is all about. And I think that will certainly help defensive recruiting. But if you are Ohio State and you can go out with all those eyes on you, both in the stadium and outside, but mostly those guys on campus, those recruits on campus. And, if you're a Bucknuts VIP member, jump on our front row page. Bill Kurlick has a list of all the visitors that are expected for that Notre Dame game. You put on a show that night, both offensively and defensively. You do something like DG's score here of 48-24 with a late score. I think that resonates not only for people this year and what you're going to be in 2022, but with the recruits out there that are watching and considering Ohio State. Obviously, there's more to it than just one game, but the guys you're going to have on campus, I think that game is just colossal. And to have it week one and to have it here in Columbus, I don't know how many of you guys are going to be able to get to that game. I've talked to several of my buddies that have been like, hey, can you get me tickets? No, I can't get you tickets. But I know that game is just going to be off the chain. I'm so excited for it. I'm sure you guys are too. It's going to be a fun one. And the Buckeyes need to show up. It needs to be, the best performance they can give out of the gates. And I think they know that. They've made it very clear at that point or throughout the offseason that they know what kind of game that is and what's on the line there. So, well, we've done it. We've gone through. We're just over 50 minutes here, so almost a full happy hour. And cheers again to those people out there. If you're watching or are listening later, look, as I said at the beginning, I want this. Yeah, Shane, you make a good point. LeBron James' son will also it reportedly be on an official visit to Ohio State for that game. So it sounds like he's going to be attending the game with his dad if that works out. But still, not a bad kid to have in attendance and maybe land a name like that if he ends up going to college. But we'll talk basketball down the road. It's almost football season. Look, as I said before, this is new. This is the first time we're doing this. My plan is to do this each week, Thursday or Friday. Some Fridays are going to be tough because of travel and things like that as we get in the schedule. So we'll kind of play it by ear. I'd like to have a reporter who covers the other team on to talk about the opponent, and you guys can ask some questions. I'll ask some questions. We'll go through what happens each week as we go as well. But I want this to be like a happy hour you'd have with your buddies. I want more comments as we go. Well, obviously later in the day, I think we'll be able to get more. But if you're watching live, the comment section, I want that to blow up. And we'll just chat Buckeyes each week. I'll give my thoughts. We can argue some if you guys want. I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be something a little different than the BM5, maybe something a little different than some of the other Ohio State podcasts out there because I know there's a ton of them. So, look, this is your last weekend before Buckeye football. This is your first weekend of college football, week 0. There's some good games out there this weekend. Normally, I'm going to have a game for you guys that I'll be watching. There's not a ton this week. A couple Big Ten teams playing, so if you want to tune into that. But my advice, enjoy this last weekend before we get going. And certainly we're going to enjoy this football season. I thank everybody who tuned in for this one. First episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I'm looking forward to doing this throughout the year. If whatever platform you're watching on, like, subscribe, that helps us a lot. If you're not a Bucknuts VIP member, I recommend doing it. Even if you're not a recruiting guy, we try and bring as much interesting information as we can give you. So we always appreciate it. The interactions on the front row are great. So, join up. This is a great time. The Buckeyes are about to embark on what should be a fantastic season. I think it's going to be fun. Everybody enjoy your weekend. Cheers.